You found your way to Whispers of Crimes, a quiet corner where the shadows of the past are gently told. Here, we speak of real crimes and mysteries, not to shock or scare, but to wonder, to reflect, and maybe to help you fall asleep. So close your eyes, let your thoughts slow down, and come with me into tonight's case. He walked among them, a figure of authority, a man sworn to protect. To the world, he was just another officer, doing his job, living his life, but behind the uniform, behind the badge, he harbored something far darker. For nearly 2 decades, a monster roamed the forests and streets of Siberia. A predator who blended in, who wore the mask of a protector while leaving a trail of terror in his wake. He was known as the Angarsk maniac, but those who knew him as Mikhail Popkov. A man who would never be suspected. A man who had the perfect cover. But when the truth finally surfaced, it was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. 83 victims, decades of terror. And the question that still remains, how did he get away with it for so long? This is the story of the man who wore the badge and became the nightmare. And it's only just beginning. Chapter 1, The Model Officer. Mikhail Popkov was, by all accounts, an ordinary man. His colleagues would describe him as diligent, trustworthy, and disciplined, a man who held his duties as a police officer in high regard. Born in the Soviet Union, Popkov was raised in a time when duty and loyalty to the state were paramount. By the early 1990s, he had become a police officer in Angarsk, a small city in Siberia, an area that was beginning to feel the strains of post-Soviet turmoil. The police force in Angarsk, as with many parts of Russia, struggled with corruption, underfunding, and inefficiency. On the surface, Popkov blended in. He lived in a modest apartment with his wife, Elena, and their young daughter. He had friends, acquaintances, and a relatively uneventful life outside of his job. His reputation was solid. He was known to be reliable, always taking his duties seriously, whether it was handling a routine traffic stop or conducting an investigation. His family never suspected a thing, and neither did his neighbors. The man they saw was the embodiment of a well-adjusted family man. He was a figure of authority, someone you'd never expect to be hiding a grotesque secret. However, beneath this facade of normalcy, Popkov was beginning to harbor dark, twisted thoughts. The violent urges that simmered within him were not apparent at first. His colleagues recalled that he would often work alone, away from the hustle and bustle of the department. What they didn't know was that during those times, Popkov was planning the gruesome acts that would soon begin to define his life. In 1992, Popkov murdered his first known victim, though authorities wouldn't realize it for years. The body of a woman was discovered in a remote forest near Angarsk. She had been brutally attacked and left for dead. It wasn't unusual for women to disappear in this part of Siberia, and at first, there was no obvious link between this death and others that would follow. But as more bodies began to surface, all showing signs of extreme violence, investigators began to realize they were dealing with a serial killer. Yet, the police department was ill-equipped to handle such a case, and Popkov's position within the force gave him an advantage that no one had considered. Chapter 2. The first killings and the pattern emerges by the mid-1990s. Popkov's killing spree had begun in earnest. The bodies of women were turning up across Angarsk and the surrounding areas, often in isolated spots far from the city center. The women were typically in their late teens to early 30s. Many of them were considered at risk by local standards. They were often found intoxicated, walking alone late at night, or involved in activities that Popkov likely deemed immoral. He believed these women were somehow deserving of punishment. It's important to note the chilling consistency in the way Popkov carried out his murders. He used his job as a police officer to his advantage, offering women rides in his police car or simply pretending to be someone who could be trusted. Popkov knew exactly how to manipulate these women. He would convince them that he was helping them or that they had no reason to be afraid of him. Once he had his victims alone, Popkov's brutality knew no bounds. Some of the women were strangled. Others were stabbed multiple times with a knife or an axe tools he kept in his car. Many were sexually assaulted. The first murder of his known victims was so shocking in its violence that it left detectives scratching their heads. No one could understand why someone would commit such savage acts. What made Popkov's murders even more disturbing was the cold, methodical nature of his approach. He didn't just kill. He often tortured his victims, taking his time to ensure that their deaths were as painful as possible. He chose remote locations for his murders, carefully selecting spots where the bodies would be difficult to find. In some cases, Popkov would cover the bodies with dirt or leaves, further hindering discovery. The police were unaware of the pattern forming beneath their noses. Even as the bodies stacked up, there was no obvious link between them. Each victim seemed to be an isolated case. Popkov's ability to carefully conceal his actions and blend into his surroundings allowed him to continue his killing spree unchecked. His connection to law enforcement gave him the perfect cover. When he wasn't actively committing his murders, he was offering theories on other unsolved cases. He was not a suspect. He was part of the investigation. By the late 1990s, Popkov had killed at least 10 women, though the authorities had no way of knowing it. The murders seemed random and were eventually classified as unsolved homicides, with no apparent motive. The police had no idea they were dealing with a killer in their midst. Chapter 3: A Double Life and Increasing Brutality. As the 2000s unfolded, Popkov's killings began to follow a more predictable pattern, but they were also escalating in brutality. His need to kill had become an addiction, and it was clear that Popkov had developed a ritual. He would pick up women under the guise of providing a safe ride, taking them to secluded areas, and then overpowering them. As time went on, Popkov's violence became more extreme. He didn't just kill for the sake of killing. He seemed to view his actions as a form of cleansing a warped sense of moral duty. According to Popkov's later confessions, he was driven by the belief that he was eliminating immoral women from society, those who he believed were contributing to its decay. His own twisted logic made him feel justified in his actions. He saw himself as a sort of avenger vigilante, punishing those he deemed unworthy. But as his crimes became more frequent, they also became more disorganized. Popkov was growing more reckless. He began taking greater risks, committing murders in areas where he had once been cautious. His need to kill had grown insatiable. In one particularly gruesome case, Popkov attacked a woman in broad daylight, stabbing her repeatedly with an axe before fleeing the scene. This was unlike anything he had done before, so brazen, so out of character. Popkov's increasing confidence did not go unnoticed by his colleagues, but still, they did not suspect him. His behavior remained mostly unchanged. He remained a loyal member of the police force, continuing his job without raising any red flags. But the community around him began to feel the weight of the fear that Popkov had instilled. Women were scared to walk the streets at night. Rumors about a maniac on the loose began to swirl. In 2005, the media picked up on these rumors, dubbing the killer the Angarsk maniac. But even as the press reported on the increasing number of murders, they failed to make the connection between the police officer and the grisly killings. Popkov had managed to hide in plain sight for more than a decade. Chapter 4: The investigation begins. By 2006, the authorities had finally begun to take a closer look at the murders. The bodies were too numerous, and the brutality too consistent for the killings to be written off as random acts of violence. But despite their efforts, investigators still couldn't connect the dots. It was at this point that Popkov's past as an officer began to work against him. By now, Popkov had left the police force, taking a job as a security guard and later a private contractor. But he remained in Angarsk, living among the same people. He continued his spree, though, with less frequency. By the time investigators were closing in on the killer, Popkov had already killed more than 20 women. In 2012, Russian authorities launched a massive investigation into the murders. This time, they focused on DNA testing. Thousands of men who had worked in law enforcement during the years of the killings were asked to provide samples. Popkov was among those tested, and when the results came in, the investigators were stunned. His DNA was a match for multiple crime scenes. Popkov had been caught. At first, Popkov denied everything. He insisted that he was innocent, that there had been a mistake. But as investigators presented the mounting evidence against him, including DNA samples, witness testimonies, and even his own confession, Popkov's resolve began to crack. His confession was chilling. He admitted to killing at least 22 women, but he would later claim to have killed up to 83 in total. Chapter 5. The Mind of a Monster. Mikhail Popkov's confession was methodical. He recounted the murders in vivid detail, describing the women he had targeted, the tools he used, and how he disposed of the bodies. He told investigators how he had perfected his technique over the years, becoming more skilled at evading detection. But what struck them most was the coldness with which he spoke about his victims. Popkov showed no remorse. He described his murders as though they were no more significant than a routine task. There was no guilt, no sorrow, just a chilling sense of justification. He believed that he had been doing society a favor by eliminating what he saw as immoral women. His warped sense of righteousness made him feel invincible. He saw himself as a judge, jury, and executioner, with no fear of retribution. Popkov's story was disturbing not only because of the violence, but because of how cold and calculated he had been throughout the years. He had blended in seamlessly with society, manipulating those around him, all while concealing his true nature. Even as a police officer, he was able to turn his position of trust into an advantage, using it to lure victims into his grasp. And as a family man, he maintained an image of normalcy, hiding the monster within. Chapter 6. A Prolific Killer's Final Years. After his arrest, Popkov was convicted of 22 murders and sentenced to life in prison, but his confessions continued. In the following years, he revealed more details about his killings and led investigators to additional bodies that had never been found. In total, Popkov confessed to 83 murders. However, there were those who believed that the true number of his victims was even higher, perhaps over 100. Despite his incarceration, Popkov's notoriety grew. He became one of Russia's most infamous serial killers, eclipsing even the likes of Andrei Chikatilo in terms of his brutality and the sheer number of victims. His case raised uncomfortable questions about law enforcement corruption and how a killer could operate within the very system meant to stop them. For the families of Popkov's victims, justice was slow. Many victims remained unidentified, and some were mistakenly thought to have died from natural causes or accidents before Popkov's confession came to light. While Popkov's arrest brought closure to some, it also left deep wounds in the communities affected by his actions. Chapter 7. Legacy and Reflection. Mikhail Popkov remains imprisoned to this day, serving life sentences for his horrific crimes. He is kept in isolation to prevent him from harming others. But his story has left a dark legacy. His case serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of abuse of power, especially within law enforcement, and how a man's outward respectability can completely mask the monster within. Popkov's chilling confidence and his ability to evade capture and his complete lack of remorse have left investigators and the public alike shaken. His crimes span nearly 2 decades, and he used his knowledge of law enforcement to cover his tracks at every turn. It was only after years of painstaking investigation, countless unsolved murders, and a massive DNA collection effort that he was finally brought to justice. Popkov's story is a haunting one, a tale of power, manipulation, and murder, and it reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones that walk among us, wearing the masks of normality and authority. That's all for tonight's story. Another thread in the web of true crime, quietly unraveling as the night goes on. If you're still with me, thanks for listening. And if sleep has already taken you, may your dreams be peaceful and your mind at ease. I'll be here next time by the fire with another story waiting to be told. Good night, and don't forget to lock your doors.